That was fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip down memory lane. I'm going to show some P-LED projects, or B-LED, before LED, but they suggest some of the possibilities of that Kevin was talking about. I'd also like to thank Derek and Parsons for having us here today, and looking forward to the conversation that follows.
Excuse me, before you
yes.
start, since this is about visual perception,
sure.
can we turn the lights down in here?
Yeah, actually, I'm okay with that if you want.
Slides, which are quite good.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that. Yeah. I was actually meant to mention that. Yeah. We architects love to have slides of our work, you know, be especially sharp and prominent. Before getting into talking about the subject of how some key ideas in projects that we have done are communicated through the kind of dynamic interaction between material and light, I wanted to talk about kind of our framework for design. So we, at our firm, have a very relational approach to design, in that we think of architecture as being part of a complex web of relationships, and that this is an inherently dynamic state. And this dynamic condition fundamentally engages change because of events and people and places that change over time, and because of our movement within them, and because of the activities that go on within them. We've thought about this, and this really changes depending upon the scale of work that we do. So we've thought about this relative to very long duration change and architecture that can be part of framing infrastructure and public space. In this case, this is a proposal that we did for Lower Manhattan that was part of an exhibition at MoMA called Rising Currents. Actually, David's firm was one of the other exhibitors in this, and we collaborated with a landscape architect named Susanna Drake on this project. On the scale of a building, change happens perhaps more quickly, but something that quaint term from the days when I was a student called building types, and how organizational structures for buildings or for activities and institutions gave rise to certain configurations of buildings. This is actually a student residence that we completed recently at Tulane University, but a kind of example of this sort of building scale change. And then what I'll be focusing on mostly is the way in which architecture engages change on the scale of the body through perception and through the changing position of the body in space, which of course is oftentimes more acutely felt on the scale of a room, but also engages qualities of a site, how we perceive the context in which we exist with respect to conditions outside ourselves, the place we're in. This is a couple of images of Knoll Company's headquarters offices here in New York that we designed. Actually, for this project and the previous one, Tillotson Design Associates were the lighting designer. So the 4 projects I'm going to be talking about specifically engage aspects of sight and experience through how light is, we conceived of light relative to the kind of fundamental ideas of each project, which I'll talk about. The first one is actually taking us back to Times Square, the U.S. Armed Forces Recruiting Station in Times Square. And this project was completed in 1999, so definitely pre-LED. And one of the things that we were intrigued by, and actually this project had no lighting designer, believe it or not. We were a sub-consultant to Parsons Brinkerhoff on this project, and we had some informal consultations with lighting people, but the circumstances didn't allow for one. So we were, and also the context was interesting in that the extreme amount of ambient light and dynamic ambient light made it very difficult to kind of predict and understand how any kind of light we would bring to this context might actually be perceived. And we had limited capabilities for modeling this. But basically, very small building, 500 square feet roughly, in the center of this kind of cacophonous context. And we were intrigued by how the building could become not simply distinct by being formally different from what was around it, which to us felt like it would have been kind of silly given the scale of all this space, but how it could participate in its site in a kind of more rich way. And this is an early rendering that we did of the project, where we thought about the way of conceiving the principal facades of the building as kind of abstracted flags one symbol that we felt could unite the four armed services that occupy the building, just barely unite them from the rivalries that they have. But also here, the notion that there would be this kind of reflection of the context simultaneous with the production of light from the light sources that we located inside the building. So this kind of merging of symbol with context in a way more deeply than if the building was simply a sign, a kind of inhabited sign. And homage to Dan Flavin, we created this pattern through a series of gel-covered fluorescent light fixtures. Very simple. These were done with a 3M retroreflective film that was contained within a sleeve, a transparent sleeve that wrapped around each bulb. And we experimented with a lot of different configurations. Some of them yielded the French flag, so that was unacceptable. But we finally got to the American flag. And this was actually integrated with the facade. So this was a custom curtain wall where the proximity of the glass to the fixture is actually what begins to activate this building more so than even the fixture itself, and also the relative ambient light around the building. So this is a custom stainless steel curtain wall, and the fixtures basically were all located right behind it in small stainless steel channels. And so what you have sort of simultaneously is the presentation of the symbol, the flag, but also it's a building, and you can look through the building, and depending upon your proximity to the building and the ambient outdoor light conditions, the building is both transparent but also reflective. So you can see that here in these views, a nighttime view on the left and a daytime view on the right, where in fact the building becomes a kind of participant in this larger context and takes on a character that merges the sort of symbol of our country with this kind of larger commercial enterprise. So that has changed dramatically. We were not involved in this relighting of the building. So this is kind of a classic example of the Armed Forces Recruitment Command saying, well, we've got this technology and now let's use as much of it as possible. So they basically used LEDs, which are fantastic, and if they just maybe used them in a little bit narrower strips, some of that connection, I think, between the interior of the building and the exterior would have been preserved. But if you go by there now, this is the, I took these a few weeks ago, this is the effect that you have. So I'm intrigued by the way in which LEDs could become so ubiquitous that we don't think we have to use them kind of in the, in the most extensive manner possible. But it is very interesting just in terms of that kind of very clear phenomenal difference that occurs. Completely different site. This one really thinking about daylight. And here, this is a residence that we designed in Martha's Vineyard that is on a site overlooking the ocean, a beautiful bluff in a scrub oak woods. So one of the things we were intrigued about was how the house at this kind of threshold between land and water could become grounded in its site and become a kind of embodiment of some of the aspects of the site in which it was located. And we were intrigued by these scrub oak trees. They all were planted probably in the early 20th century. They were all about the same height. They were very gnarled and lichen covered and kind of had this amazing quality of form, but also they cast these shadows on the ground and on each other. And they weren't that tall. They all are roughly maybe 25 feet high or so, 20 feet high. So we experimented with creating walls that could cast shadows on themselves. So we were intrigued about how the house could begin to emulate this quality through its architecture. And we wound up with a kind of homage to both the sort of vernacular building traditions of this region. This is cedar siding. But by varying the depth and the width of the siding, we could create a surface that began to, again, cast shadows on itself, had a kind of depth and texture that was unexpected. And this quality changes, of course, depending upon the time of day and whether or not there's even sunlight out. So they become flatter, obviously, with more diffuse light. and attain greater depth, and also at different times of day because these walls face different orientations as well. Not to mention, by the way in which the wall surfaces will weather differently and have weathered differently depending upon their orientation. So the walls essentially are oriented or scaled to the landscape. You enter the view on the left, kind of interior court space that's between the house and the water, and then as you turn the corner, the walls give way to an opening. This wall changes direction and passes through the center of the house. And one of the most intriguing things that we discovered, and I think the kind of surprise and discovery that you have through design, but also through the way light interacts with form, is something that's really notable. Maybe we can talk about later as well. But this phenomena of how the setting sun passed through the building was something we noticed during construction and hadn't thought about, but is just, again, a kind of ineffable quality that we couldn't have anticipated. But as these walls slide into the interior, they then begin to come apart, and you see they form a screen separating one part of the interior from another, and also revealing kind of the constituent parts of the construction of the wall. And then, of course, the house mostly open toward the water, but framed partially by these wood walls. So really on two scales, the scale of the overall object and the size of these large surfaces, the house kind of embeds itself or is grounded within the site. And then on the scale of the room as well, the way in which these walls move between inside and outside begins to define views or to frame views and connect the site to its context in a different way. The third project, which I really wish we had LEDs when we did this project, this was completed actually in 2000. But I think it's an amazing example of what we could have achieved with just analog technology. We worked with Bill Schwinghammer, the lighting designer, on this project. And this was a store and spa for Shiseido called Kiora. It was on in Midtown on Madison Avenue. And the genesis for the idea of the project was to kind of create this quality that the product purported to have, which was this sort of sense of calm that it would induce in the people who were using it. Actually, my father was a scientist, and I was extremely skeptical throughout this process. They actually claimed studies at Harvard University that had somehow proved this. But anyway, there's no question in my mind that light can connect you to some of these feelings, and that's what we tried to do. But also, interestingly, to do so in a context, kind of dense urban context. So how can you create this kind of space of calm through light in this kind of dense urban context that embodies these qualities of the product? And that's the packaging for the product, which had been designed previously. It's quite beautiful. So we actually designed the project on a light box. Early studies we made where we literally masked off the site and built small scale models, really no bigger than about 8 or 10 inches in length, to begin to look at how light itself could be conceived of as a material that could define space and create this ambiance or this atmosphere, and cycled through a number of these. The final result was to eliminate the presence of fixtures entirely, so that you wouldn't see any evidence of an actual light source, but that you would feel the presence of light itself. And we basically lined the two walls of the space with a series of stripped fluorescent lights that were 2 different color temperatures and were connected to an automated dimming system. And these fixtures were scrimmed with fabric, and that would create a kind of glow, and which also makes your skin look really good too. So that was a hidden or additional benefit. And at the same time, we also wanted to eliminate kind of the conventional elements that architecture sometimes has when it creates form. Wanted to get as close as possible to just this quality of light and space, and so worked with suspended organza strips that were dyed. We worked with a wonderful designer, fabric designer named Mary Bright on this project, and basically used these suspended strips to demise the retail area from the spa area. This is only a 1,500 square foot space, so a very small space. And then just using gravity and the width that this fabric came, roughly 50 or 60 inches wide, to define the space. And then the product was located both on the perimeter wall, so it received backlight from the fluorescent fixtures, but also was located on a series of vitrines that were illuminated with fiber optic light that had a color wheel that would actually provide light that would make the bottles themselves glow. So the bottles really and the product packaging became the kind of ornament in the space and brought scale down to the interior. And because there was a lower level that was a storage space and offices below, we were able to put the LED boxes essentially underneath where these vitrines were located. So this combination of the changing light that happened through these vitrines, but also the kind of subtle color temperature changes, almost like when a cloud passes in front of the sun, were qualities that we felt like could sort of bring about this new kind of sensation of being outdoors in a way, a kind of calm environment. And finally, the building, of course, being a kind of flagship for this product, became a sort of lantern to the street at night. But then during the day, we had a greater number of fixtures located toward the front of the space, so that that barrier between the glass and between the sidewalk and the interior could help be partly broken down by having relatively more illumination to the front. And just a detail of the interior. So the last project I'll talk about is one in which really is a kind of elaboration of the idea of a scrim. It's a theme, of course, pursued in many different ways in theater, of course, and design and architecture, but in this case, to begin to shape interior space according to activities that occurred within it. This is on an upper floor of the San Remo apartment building on the Central Park West. You can kind of date this photograph by those Christo's gates in the foreground there. But this is the view that you have from the living space. And basically, the intent was to transform a relatively small apartment, about 2,500 square feet, from a kind of pre-war series of rooms into a more open, loft-like environment. Interestingly, also, it receives light from 360-degree orientation, so all light from all times of day. And we conceived of a series of screens that we designed that would, in a way, dress the space. So they partly, just through their proportions, helped to create a kind of verticality. We made the ceiling as tall as we could, but it's still only about 9.5 feet high. So it breaks some of the horizontality of the space, but also allowed for kind of selective connection of areas of the interior, particularly between the sitting room and the living room, or the entry area and the living room, such that there are openings in these panels that are oriented to either be low down and allow you to see through them when you're sitting, or high up so that you can see through them when you're standing. So, and then there are, in this case, 6 pairs of panels, so you can vary the configuration depending upon the degree of connection that you want to make between these two sides of the space. The client had come to us because they had seen laser cut studies we had done where we took very thin basswood, about 1/16 of an inch thick, and laser cut it from both sides, which revealed a kind of depth and texture to the material that was quite unexpected, and also a kind of porosity. It made a sort of translucency to an opaque material, which was very exciting to us. And so we scaled that up using CNC milling technology to the size of these panels, first with some intermediate studies in our office. These are formaldehyde-free MDF panels, and then a custom stainless steel frame. Some of them are fixed, some of them are movable with these openings in them. And then this shows you from the opposite direction as the previous 2 images, kind of the living room to sitting room space with these moving panels, and then how these panels exist within the larger context of the apartment and form a kind of armature for that space. And then, again, a detail of this, the way in which the panels filter view and also light. This did actually have an early LED. This was finished in 2006. This has LED strip lights that are integrated, which I know can be done much better than they were done here, where you kind of see the individual sources. But they basically create a raking light on the surface of the panels, which can be turned on or off to either diminish or enhance that perception of view through the panels themselves. So here's a detail up close. The panel pattern and whatnot was something that was developed with a lot of testing, but basically to create something that would have a kind of variation, but would break the kind of brittle surface of the MDF to create this kind of depth, both literally in the surface and then visually beyond. And this relates to something that Kevin also mentioned, that one of the interesting qualities, again, and just to conclude, it's fascinating to then have kind of architecture out in actual daylight or ambient conditions. This apartment had a condition where the master bedroom actually faced west to the Hudson, and you have incredible light. This apartment gets a Manhattan henge condition on or about June 21st, where the light passes straight through the building, because on the 25th floor of that structure, so there aren't any shadows in front of it. And but also the color temperature of the light changes, of course, with the setting sun or the rising sun, and these screens act in a way to filter that light as well onto other surfaces. And maybe one of the most surprising things that I didn't even think about or notice until we were photographing, having the project photographed, was the way in which at night these panels merged with, and this is almost impossible to really get the true sense of it. This is the best we could do in the photograph, but they merge with your view of the kind of glowing lights that are in buildings outside on the other side of Central Park and in Lower Manhattan. So there's this kind of scalar shift and a kind of different kind of participation between the interior and the larger city that, again, is something very subtle, but it's definitely there, that kind of connects the interior way beyond sort of the intimate scale of the people who live there. So I think I'll wrap that up just to stay on schedule, but basically, we've of course done many other projects. These are ones that I thought would be helpful to talk about just because they're didactic in the sense that the scale of the project and the intent we brought for it really was elaborated through a very careful and specific interest in light, both daylight and electric light. Thank you.